To the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. When he said that New Zealand would catch up with Australia, has National, since it became government, narrowed or widened the gap in average weekly earnings and levels of employment?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, because of the difficulties in comparing data on a consistent basis, well, last week I asked the Parliamentary Library for its annual series on average weekly earnings, which I presume is actually the same source of the members' figures. And what this shows is that between 2008-9 and 2009-10, the weekly wage gap between New Zealand and Australia, if you measure this as in absolute dollars, increased slightly from $213 a week to $219 a week. If you measure this as a percentage gap, as we always did in opposition, it decreased from 30 to 29, and in fact decreased from 35%.
Oh, great.
Well, if the members want to talk about closing the gap, one gap I know will be closing is the time between when he's no longer Leader of the Opposition and David Cunliffe.
Just to assist the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, because of that unnecessary additional part to the answer, maybe the Prime Minister might answer the bit about employment, levels of employment. Sorry? Well, I couldn't hear it, so if the Prime Minister assures me he did, I'll accept
No, I
his
was getting
word
on to that. It was just getting a little noisy. So none of this takes away from the fact that the average after-tax wage in Australia is now just over $50,000 a year, while in New Zealand it's just over $39,000 a year, and there's a lot of catching up to do. In terms of employment, again, if you use absolute numbers, the difference in employment has widened by 200,000, whereas if you use percentages, the employment rate in New Zealand is actually higher than it is in Australia. As I've said before, catching Australia is never going to be easy.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, supplementary question. Mr Speaker, in answering the question last week to the House about average weekly earnings for Australia and New Zealand, why didn't he quote the figures for 2008, 2009 and 2010 and own up to the fact that even on his own statistics, since he became Prime Minister, the wage gap between Australia and New Zealand has got wider, not narrower, as he promised?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, A, because it hasn't. B, no it hasn't. B, because in 2009-10 I did quote that number in the House last week. And C, if the member is so hopeless he can't ask the right question or think on his feet, no wonder David Cunliffe's going to replace him.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, how does the Prime Minister explain the Statistics New Zealand figures out today that show that wage increases over the last year have increased at a slower rate than prices have gone up, have increased at half the rate that they were increasing when Labor was in government 2 years ago, and have increased at half the rate of Australian wage increases over the comparable period?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, well, I think it's worth remembering one thing. The parting government after 9 years of parting gift after 9 years of a Labor government was a recession. That's actually what New Zealand inherited from these people over there. But if we want to talk about prices, let's do that for a moment. Electricity under a Labor government up 72%. Negligible claims here. Interest rates under a Labor government through the roof. Petrol prices under a Labor government $2.11 versus $1.75. Emissions trading scheme under a Labor government twice as expensive as one under National. Mr Speaker, I could go on and on.
Order. A point of order has been called and no one will go on and on.
Point of order,
Darren Hughes.
Mr Speaker. I know the Leader of the Opposition in his question made a reference to the previous government and the record of the previous government, so there was fair licence for the Prime Minister to make some comment about that. But we've now got into the point where the Prime Minister is reciting a whole lot of information that is unnecessary to the question. He should get on with the substance of the answer, which is the question that Mr Goff has put to him.
Order. A point of order is being considered. And regrettably, the question did ask also how the Prime Minister explained something, and of course how the Prime Minister might explain something is the Prime Minister's business. But the member is quite right at this point where I think we had heard quite enough, and I'll invite the Honourable Leader of the Opposition to ask a further supplementary.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, with unemployment rates in New Zealand under his watch for the first time in more than a decade exceeding the unemployment rates in Australia, does he expect the Household Labour Force survey this week to show an increase or a decrease in New Zealand unemployment at the same time that Australian unemployment has been declining?
Speaker, it's not my job, nor am I going to make predictions about the Household Labour Force survey. But what I can say is this, though, Mr. Speaker. One way to get employment rates rising and unemployment rates down is to have flexibility in the labour markets. That's something the Leader of the Opposition believes in when he's on Jamie Mackay's farming show, but not something when Andrew Little's running the show.
Mr. Tremaine. Mr. Tremaine.
Supplementary question to the Prime Minister.
Order.
What impact will the government's income tax cuts on 1 October have on relative after-tax incomes between New Zealand and Australia?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, what an excellent question. When the government's tax cuts cut in on 1 October, the gap in after-tax wages in New Zealand and Australia will have narrowed a little since December 2008, factoring in Australia's tax changes on 1 July. Based on average weekly ordinary time earnings and adjusted for effects like exchange rate changes, New Zealand's average after-tax income will be about 78% of Australia's, compared with 75.2% of Australia's average after-tax income in December 2008. I might add that tax cuts are just one of the government's policies to get faster growth and boost incomes. Other measures include investments in roads, broadband and electricity, cutting red tape, science and investment, balanced employment law reform, RMA reforms too, more money for tourism, aquaculture reforms, trade negotiations and controlling debt.
Mr. Speaker, does he expect inflation in New Zealand over the next year to peak at a level of price increases more than double that of Australia? And is that because he is pushing up consumption taxes to 50% higher than consumption taxes in Australia?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, firstly, as we know, there will be a rise in inflation caused in the first instance by a rise in GST. But of course the Reserve Bank Governor looks through that, so that'll have no impact. But I might add that inflation under this government's watch has been about half of what it was under that government's watch. And of course one way to get inflation to go through the roof is of course to spend money like there's no tomorrow. That's what that government did.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister confirm that this appears on the National Party website today under the heading Building the Recovery, that the sheet is totally blank and that is an uncharacteristically honest reflection of National's plans and thinking in this area?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, but what I can confirm is that's the number of people who have signed up their support for Phil Goff as the leader.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Order. Order.
What a gutless answer.
Order.
Yeah.
There'll be order. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Supplementary question.
Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister have sufficient conviction in the promise that he made to New Zealanders that he would close the wage gap with Australia by 2025 by committing to setting benchmarks against which his progress towards that goal can be measured year by year?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
A number of things. Firstly, I stand by the goal of trying to close that wage gap by 2025. Secondly, I stand by the view that it's a very complex thing and will take some time, and no one's ever argued it would be in one day. Speaker, I stand by the data produced by the Parliamentary Library that shows the gap is already closing. But, Mr. Speaker, if I could just take one moment, I want to read a few of the...
Point of order, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, before the Prime Minister takes another moment, you'll recall that my question was quite specific about would he commit himself to benchmarks to measure his progress towards his own objective. He hasn't touched on that at all. No, he hasn't.
Order. The member has repeated his question and reminded the Prime Minister of what he asked about benchmarks, and I would invite the Right Honourable Prime Minister to answer the question.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll make a challenge to the Leader of the Opposition, and I will have benchmarks.